السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب فيكم مجددا في
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Again, I would like to welcome you at the sixth annual meeting for the Gulf Studies Forum. I have a small suggestion. Let us take a concentrated cup of coffee at this time after lunch so that we concentrate better on this session. This session tackles energy policies and climate change in the Gulf. We have listened to other papers during the morning, and we have seen how public policy making as a concept has evolved in the GCC states, moving from a rentier state with the first oil boom in the 70s, later on during also the 90s, and now evolving in a way that is aligned with a sustainable model for long-term development to achieve social and economic objectives. From the colleagues' papers, we have seen that such plans and policies weren't clear in terms of policy making or policy endorsement. There is no transparency at the level of accountability, assessment, or development of such plans. And this raised questions regarding the impartiality of these policies and whether they were oriented towards long-term development or rather short-term solutions. The energy sector will be discussed in this session. It has the same importance as the CSO sector and economic diversification sector discussed during the first two sessions. Energy is not only the cornerstone of development, but it is also a paramount in public policy making in all states. In this session, we have panelists who are specialized in energy. They will discuss issues that are more and more challenging nowadays, not only for a Paris agreement or the Biodiversity Convention, but also in terms of the necessity of fighting climate change and exploring renewable sources of energy to mitigate such challenges. First, Mr. Rachid El-Bazzim. He is a researcher at Ibn Zohar University in Agadir in Morocco. He is a former professor of public law at Hassan University. He has published numerous studies on energy in the Gulf, most recently the Gulf States and Challenges of Transformations in Energy, published in Siyasat Arabiya in 2019, and another study entitled Anticipating the Future of Energy Transition in the Arab World, a study of the Moroccan model, which was published in Istishraf for Future Studies in 2018. Mr. El-Bazzim will talk to us about the nationally determined contributions and climate change mitigation policies in the Arab Gulf states. Mr. Bazzim, the floor is yours. Thank you, Mrs. Chairperson, for this introduction, a brief but also an accurate introduction of this paper. I extend my thanks as well to the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. In addition to the economic and political challenges facing the GCC states, there are environmental challenges as well, and these challenges has become universal. However, in the GCC region, the environmental challenges pertain to natural phenomena in this region, such as desertification, lack of biodiversity, extreme weather temperatures. Today, any person is now exposed to such natural phenomena, and such phenomena call for a response in terms of such universal challenges. And today there are facts relating to CO2 emissions per capita in the Gulf states combined. For example, the USA CO2 emissions per capita, according to statistics of the World Bank of 2014, has increased. And such statistics are periodically updated on the World Bank website. Such challenges fighting climate change make us think worldwide. The GCC efforts should overlap with international efforts in order to mitigate environmental climate change. The environmental process now is endorsing Paris Convention. The latest country to endorse this convention is Sultanate of Oman in May 2019. The legal process is about the nationally determined contributions. The NDCs were endorsed by a Paris Convention. They are national commitments, optional commitments that every nation subscribes to. Kyoto Protocol had a different approach. For example, it set out targets from a top-down perspective. However, now every nation assigns its own nationally determined contributions, and this is a rather bottom-up approach geared towards encouraging such states and such countries to commit to reducing CO2 emissions and fulfill their targets. So in this context, of course, there are numerous researchers who believe that coordinating public and national policies is one of the top priorities to promote the success of fulfilling and achieving nationally determined contributions. Relying on national vision to achieve nationally determined contributions is a good indicator to see to which extent such commitments are being fulfilled and complied with. So here there is a problematic. How should we construe and assess the nationally determined contributions of the GCC states in light of their long-term development plan in order to mitigate climate change and within the perspective of economic diversification. In the first session we have spoken lengthily about economic diversification and their sustainability or viability. There is a sort of evolution, especially when we measure the non-oil revenues percentage or ratio to oil revenues. So, environmental change isn't only about changing the environment or mitigating environmental risk, but also affecting or influencing economic initiatives. How can the GCC states define a nationally determined contribution and incorporate them within their national plans? And how do nationally determined contributions intersect with the targets outlined in national plans? Will the GCC state be successful in in bringing other actors on board to identify NDCs? These NDCs are determined horizontally but also vertically to see how the states can benefit from NDCs to reduce climate change. The first dimension which I propose to answer the question is about national public policies role in advancing national plans. Here, reforming the unsustainable model of the energy sector is very important. Therefore, KSA has been ambitious in mitigating CO2 emissions to 130 million tons of CO2 annually by 2030. However, and at the same time, it was aware that such ambitions cannot be always or should be linked to cannot be linked forever to the oil revenues, the oil sector revenues. The UAE was committed to several measures in order to increase clean energy to 24% out of the total energy sources by 2021. And Qatar has provided the National Qatar Vision for 2030. And in this vision, we see that Qatar will move towards a modern state that is able to achieve sustainable development. So here we see the concept of sustainable development incorporated in National Qatar Plan. Bahrain has asserted its contribution in its vision for 2030, which incorporated an economic diversification component and also efforts to reduce CO2 emissions. However, the Bahrain did not assign targets for such a contribution. It rather confirmed its strive to mitigate or reduce CO2 emissions. There are also other developing countries who aligned their nationally determined contributions with their national plans. However, there are no GCC states that mentioned SDGs within their nationally determined contributions, and this will increase the cost of climate change. The national challenges expose or highlight the national plans or national visions that are tightly linked to climate change. The long-term national plan of the country, for example, in KSA, in the declaration of the Saudi national program or national plan, has indeed incorporated the nationally determined contributions. However, in the Sultanate of Oman, the development plans or development visions didn't refer or make reference to any nationally determined contributions, but rather only measures to reduce CO2 emissions. By contrast, the UAE in its document for Vision 2020 has signaled targets to reduce CO2 emissions. So here we see a mixture of measures and procedures to align national plans and national visions with the nationally determined contributions. The other dimension is the coping mechanisms and mitigations procedures. States have work towards mitigating climate change. For example, KSA has reduced the use of gas but there was no mentioning of reducing heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we tackle these contributions vertically, we see that the approaches are highly different. Also, the outlined plans to mitigate climate change are less of a priority because they require a significant financial resources compared to coping mechanisms, and they also require experts and specialists. To answer the first problematic, we will focus as a third dimension on the benefits of the climate benefits of economic diversification. And by that I mean how economic diversification will bring benefits, environmental benefits. And here I will speak briefly about the results of the studies, namely increasing relationship or impact between short-term solutions and long-term national plans, and nationally determined contributions should be incorporated into long-term plans. And such plans should tackle the environmental component deeply. Also, the climate targets should be more comprehensive and more included in public policy making. The third outcome or result is to be aware that sustainable development objectives are being or goals are being ignored or disregarded in the GCC states, and this should be adjusted. Also, the sectoral policies in the GCC state should not be considered as a subset for development. Governments should also focus on their environmental commitments, one of them being the nationally determined contributions. Thank you, Dr. Rachid. I apologize for cutting you out, but keeping the time is very important. So to sum up what you have said, the GCC states have taken several measures to fight climate change, but such measures weren't in line or highly reflected in their national plans and visions. Thank you for this overview. Our next speaker is Dr. Amel. She will be speaking about climate change challenges and urban and water policy in the GCC state, geographic challenges.
Dr. Amel, she's Professor of Economics at the Faculty of Economic, Commercial Management Sciences at Muhammad Siddiq Ben Yahya in Algeria. She holds a PhD in International Economics and Sustainable Development from Setif University. She is the author of numerous studies of water policy and environmental effects of desalination of seawater, including desalination of seawater in Saudi Arabia, expected gains and possible costs for 2000-2014, published in 2015 in Arab Economic Studies. Please take the floor, Doctor. Then I've got the most merciful, the most compassionate. Good afternoon. Of course, talking about water is a complicated matter not only in the Arab world but on the international level. Perhaps in the Gulf states it takes another version because of the desert nature of the Gulf countries and the lack of rainwater. In addition to the fact that subterranean waters has been used now in the Arab world, there's a problem with regards to water resources. Of course, the previous speaker talked about the climate change challenges, but this is all in theory more than reality. But perhaps in the Arab state, the problem is the desalination of seawater and the problem with regards to the high consumption of energy. We will try in this paper and quickly in order to shed light on the problematic of sea water policy in the Arab world, and this policy really can implement sustainability, of course. I will speak quickly and not look at my PowerPoint. As is known, the Gulf states are in the southwest of Asia. This region is classified as a dry and semi-dry area. The fresh water is only 500 square meter per year for every individual, and the desert covers the main surface of these 6 Arab countries. The rainfall is 800 meter with an increase, and here the gap is very big. Of course, the water resources in the Arab countries is now concentrated on 3 main sources that are considered subterranean water, including the desalination of seawater, and which is considered the main water sources in the region, in addition to the recycled water, and it resulted of sewage water that is used in irrigation. Of course, I will shed light on the use of water resources in the Gulf states. According to the latest statistics, we would like to if we take into consideration the statistics related to the water level in the Arab countries, there is a great, of course, discrepancy. If we even take the official websites or figures of the states and information of the World Bank and the Arab Water Council, these statistics do not really reflect reality. If we take into consideration the statistics of the Arab countries, in the 6 GCC countries consume 600 meters squared of water per year, which is a quantity that increases the quantity of subterranean water. It is also said that Gulf states, based on the recent studies between 2012 and 2022, will dispense $200 billion on desalination of seawater, and this forms a problem for these countries, especially that the desalination of seawater really uses a large amount of energy, and the plants of desalination plants really are the main consumers of energy. If we take the water resources in the Gulf states are very scarce because of the geography of the environment. But what we look into are the practices and the lifestyle of people living in the GCC, whereby there is a high consumption of water, while there is really a scarcity of natural water resources. There is a gap between supply and demand. The demand of water has increased in the last decade, especially in the beginning of the third millennium, by 140%. But the share of per capita of residents in the GCC, for example, the UAE and KSA, we find that it is more than 200 liters per day per capita, and this is even the wealthiest country and water resources in the world did not reach this level of consumption. Of course, we always concentrate that the demand is because of the development and evolution of these economies in the GCC and the change in the demographic structure of the Arab countries. If we take, for example, Qatar and the UAE, we find 90% of the population are foreigners, and this asks a question, the change in the consumption pattern, and accordingly, these are a number of contradictions that show that really justify perhaps the increase in water demand. Also, there is a number of factors and phenomena and reasons that led to an increase in water demand. In brief and quickly, my colleague mentioned climate change, even though until now the studies are still in theory and not realistic. Even climate change, really, the climate change phenomena is now visible all over the world. Increase of temperature and climate change is something that is we have been witnessing since the dawn of time. And perhaps also the use of subterranean water in the Arab countries. In the past, we used only to dig 50 meters in order to use subterranean water, and now we are digging to a depth of 200 meters and even more. And now these subterranean waters are even have high salinity. Even now, the salination of the subterranean water will have a high cost. In addition to now the subterranean water are merging also with seawater because of the geographical nature of the Arab countries. These are the main points with regards to the water equation. With regards now to the water policy, which is of importance to us, unlike other policies, the GCC countries have succeeded in looking at water policies, even though there is a lot of problem and question marks that are being drawn on these policies, even though also nowadays there are common water policies among GCC countries, there are a large number of research papers and statistics, and the reader would think that the GCC have achieved something that rich water countries have not yet achieved. But in reality, if we look at water policy, and the policy has really looked into water resources by promoting the traditional water resources and affiliating them with untraditional water resources, desalination of seawater, imposing high water fees, etc. In addition to a number of reforms on the level of water policies, but the reality shows otherwise. Perhaps the common water policy is something we see on the surface, but if we look at every GCC country, we'll see a lot of contradiction and discrepancies. If we look at the water policy, was this policy able to achieve sustainability? On the other hand, to face the scarcity of water resources in GCC, we always talk about water governance. These terms, we like to use them on the international level. Always Arab countries use these very big and very resonant terms. If we look at a PPP, for example, cooperation, we find in the Arab countries, even there are independent institutions that look into water resources. If we look at their website, we will find contradiction and discrepancy in information and figures. And also, we will not be able to differentiate who is responsible of producing water, producing electricity, and the 6 GCC countries. Even in the 6 GCC countries, even terminology used on the level of water policy is different. If we look at the section or the part related to scarcity of water, there's a lot of water that is being wasted and squandered in the GCC. In the water authority in KSA play an important role in installation of seawater, and most of the pipelines that is being supervised by the water desalination authority are found in rugged areas, and and even managing such form of desalination are still using traditional means. If we look into exhausting water resources as a challenge faced by these 6 GCC countries, if we look at water policy and sustainability of water policy, sustainability also means that preserving the rights of the present generation and future generation. We find that the water policy in the GCC countries is inadequate because of the lifestyle of the citizens in the GCC countries and the scarcity of water resources and the development that the Gulf states really aspire to achieve, especially that Qatar and the Emirates and the UAE are ambitious and want to be ranked among developed countries. The logo of sustainability is being brandished in the GCC more than the other countries in the MENA region and Africa. But in reality, the principles of stability has not been established and implemented with regards to water policy. The Gulf states also all have a 2030 national vision in order to implement the SDGs of 2030 of the United Nations. The problem in this respect, when you try to achieve sustainability and you call for stability in certain areas and sectors, in the beginning you have to ration the consumption of water in order to move away from the mentality that water is a free commodity. Now the World Bank is setting policies in order to put price on the consumption of water. Even Turkey, as you know, in the past, when the Arab countries, even Turkey talked about the water market. If the Arab countries are exporting water, even Turkey has the right to put a fee on the exporting of water and establishing a water market. We can say that the Gulf states as of yet are not able to bridge the gap between its geography and natural environment and the scarcity of water resources. Saying that energy is the solution for the future. Because within the term of economic diversification, when we talk about diversification of economy, everything stems from energy. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Amel, for this intervention, which mentioned the same results of Dr. Rachid, that the ineffectiveness of sustainability policies in the Gulf states. Now we will move to our next speakers and our next topic, entitled Climate Change Challenges and Urban Public Policy in the Gulf Region, given by Laurent Lambert. He is a professor of public policy at the College of Public Administration and Development Economics at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. He is a former senior policy analyst at the Social Economic Survey Research Institute at the University of Qatar, a former member of the advisory board at the United Nations Climate Convention Center in charge of green technology transfer, and a former representative of the research community at the United Nations climate negotiations.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers and everyone for being here. Sorry for not being able to make it in Arabic. I wish I could speak fluently in this beautiful language, but I'm not yet there. Today, I'm going to speak to you about a very important topic, although it's very often neglected. And climate change is much often heard about in terms of temperatures. It's often heard about in terms of rainfall changing and affecting agriculture in developing countries especially. But today I would like to talk more about climate change and urban cities in the Gulf in terms of risks and in terms especially of sea level rise risks. So first, I will just very briefly mention global climate change challenges that we have right now in the Gulf in terms of risks we're facing. Sea level rise, then I will explain a bit more what it is, and then how sustainable urban development could help mitigate these risks. Finally, I will just briefly mention some research we are starting with the University of Paris Sciences Po in France. And I would like just to say a word here. I was not supposed to make the presentation. It was my colleague from France who was supposed to make it, but due to our national sports, meaning strikes, she could not fly to here. So yes, exactly. That's a national tradition, you know, to organize such festivities. You have the National Day of Qatar in December, we have strikes. Okay, so yes, thanks. So global climate change challenges. Again, just for a very quick recap, what you can see here is the increase over more than 200 years of the emissions of greenhouse gases which have been emitted from human activities, and you have it by region in terms of colors. So you can see, by the way, the Middle East really started in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, to become a significant emitter of greenhouse gases. So historically, it's not so much responsible for climate change. It's more Europe and the United States. Unfortunately, there is not much justice in climate change, and all countries are being affected. So how are they affected by this pollution, which is changing our global atmospheric circulation systems and global change of climate? Well, some of the main changes happen in terms of temperatures again. Global temperatures have increased by 1.1 degrees. It doesn't seem to be much, you know. If in one room we turn up the temperature by 1.1 degrees, people may not even notice. But the problem is that heat is also energy. And in a bubble that is our planet, if we just, at the level of the planet, increase by 1.1 degrees Celsius, the amount of energy, that's an extreme transformation of the energy which is being stored in the planet. And what it's affecting then is the rest of the climate system. So changes in rainfall and in nature globally. What does it mean? It means sometimes rainfall patterns are disturbed. Sometimes there is less rain, sometimes there is more rain, sometimes it's more violent. And we have more extremes. It means also that the seasons are being changed. Sometimes it starts later. That's what happens a lot in my country. Sometimes it starts earlier. And think about farmers. And especially in countries where farmers didn't go to university to learn their job, but when they rely on traditions, like when these birds cross the sky, this is when you have to sow these seeds. That doesn't work anymore. So this is affecting a lot of communities across the world. But what we're going to speak today about is about sea level rise. So how global oceans are being affected by this increase in temperatures. And just think about that. That's what I say always to my students. When you cook pasta or eggs, you see the water becoming warmer, takes more room in the pot. Well, but that's the same everywhere, even in the oceans. An ocean which is becoming warmer takes more space, and thus the level of the seas and ocean is rising. And at the same time, glaciers, so in Greenland and in the mountains and in Antarctica, is being affected, so it's melting. So all of that changes our global environment. The Paris Agreement normally is there to protect us from that, and it has strong ambitions which are highlighted there in terms of limiting the increase in temperature. The problem is that the Chinese and first and foremost the American governments are not respecting their engagements. The ambitions they had during the Obama administration is not being respected by the current Trump administration, which has severe consequences. Because when the United States don't want to make efforts, China doesn't want to make efforts. And if China doesn't want to make efforts, many developing countries follow. So we are in a situation where climate change is going fast and faster. In terms of sea level rise, these can have severe implications, as you will see. The Ministry of of municipalities and the environment here is paying attention to it, as much as most Ministry of Environment across the region, even in Iran, where sometimes they jail environmentalists, they pay attention to it because they have noticed the problems that we will see on the maps. But here in Qatar, they asked to a number of academics, me included, to map out what were the main risks for the state of Qatar. So we mentioned temperature rise. Again, in a hot country, it makes sense. There are studies that show that by the end of the century, there are days during which you will not be able probably to go outside because the temperature will become unbearable, meaning even sweating, which is the normal human mechanism to adapt to high temperatures, will not be enough. So these are studies made by the MIT. But there are some others. And we'll speak about these three: temperature rise, sea level rise, and increased risks of extreme environmental events. So in terms of temperature, in Doha, it has increased more than in the rest of the world. More because it's part of the Arabian Peninsula where temperatures have increased almost twice as much as in the rest of the world. And the problem is that we are also in a city which is fast increasing. So you can see at the bottom these two maps, these two satellite imageries of Doha. And from 2002 to 2015, you can see the urban sprawl. And the problem is that in addition to normal, if I may say, climate change, we have the climate of the city which is changing. Because when you have a city growing, you have the natural environment being replaced by concrete and asphalt. And they trap heat. I'm sure you have experience going on a parking lot during a hot day and feeling it's so overwhelming in terms of heat. It's much warmer. But that's what is happening, but at the level of the city. Because concrete and asphalt, not only they trap the heat, they are darker, but also their thermodynamics, the way they react to heat, is that it traps it during the day, it stores it, it's hot, and it slowly releases it at night. So it's an issue also, because the nights are not as cool as they used to be. So we have a heat temperature, but our attention will be more on sea level rise. This is what the government of Qatar stated officially. And pay attention to the figures. Qatar is extremely vulnerable to sea level rise as it is liable to inland flooding of 18.2% of its land area. That's quite substantial. At less than 5-meter rise in sea level, along with the associated adverse impacts on the population, as 96% of the population are living on coastal areas. That means, in other words, that we have 96% of the population which is at risk of sea level rise. That's a lot. That means Doha and most cities. Now, this is a projection of if we were to have a sea level rise of just 0.5 meter in the future, this pale blue compared to the dark blue is what would be recovered by water. Not on a special day, not during the tide, but during on an everyday basis. This would be the new normal, right? This is 0.5 meter. A dozen years ago, we used to think that this is what is going to happen probably at the end of the century. Now, all scientists agree this is much before the end of the century. Now, some projections say this is by 2045. Now think about the problem if you have real estate in this kind of recovered places. That's an issue. And we'll speak about that in more detail. But so, this is what is possible by 2045. This is 2 meter, which is expected by many to be at the end of the century. But of course, it will not happen overnight at the end of the century. We'll go through the threshold of 0.5 meter, 1 meter, 1.5 meters before. But this is what is expected at the end of the century, or some say by 2070. So you have this. Some say much earlier, by the way. But I try not to be a catastrophic person. And you see the increase in number. And you see the 5-meter elevation, how much of Doha. And that's with the 10 lever. That's not this century, that's the next century. But that's a lot. So I have good news. The government of Qatar is very unlikely to let water take over Doha. It will react. Now the key problem is, at what cost? So we have a number of tropical cyclones also affecting the region. Not so much Qatar, but rather, if you see to the west, or to the left, sorry, also to the west, it's Oman. To the north, it's the Gulf, it's Iran, and to the east and right, it's Pakistan and India. These are tropical cyclones, and we have, in modern times, 60 of them recorded. They come from this area or next to India, and 60 of them have caused, in recent history, an estimated $8 billion. But the problem is that they tend to be a bit bigger and bigger. Why? Because when you have climate change, you have warmer water. When you have warmer water, you have the ingredients for cyclones, tropical cyclones, and for bigger ones. So, to make a long story short, the last very big one alone costed $4 billion in Oman. It's not far. It's in Oman. And the pictures you can see here, right, are from Cyclone Gonu, which affected Muscat and a fair share of the rest of Oman and the south of Iran. Now, we have many experience from other countries, such as the United States, which were affected by Katrina. And you can see on these pictures how devastating it can be. When you look at this is a city in the United States, New Orleans, and how flooded it was by these kind of cyclones. Cyclones become increasingly possible if you have warmer waters, of course. But, of course, if you have an increase of the general level of water, this becomes more likely. And the cost here was $47 billion. So in terms of risk management, we're not speaking little money, we're speaking things which are a national security matter. That's how they deal with it in the United States, by the way. So why not here in the Gulf? But of course, we have urban planning challenges. This is the big ups and downs of the prices of the key commodity of the region, oil. And gas is almost doing the same. So this has been affected, of course, how public policy is being made in terms of urban development. And here there is important urban growth and migrations related to these big oil booms, but also period of lower oil prices. And the problem is, how do you make a sustainable urban development when you have big oil booms and big periods where you have to cut? How you make sustainable projects, how do you implement them over time when your source of income for the government is not necessarily reliable, when you may have big cuts in budget due to fallen oil prices? So, in theory, this is the framework for the development of Qatar's cities and general development, the National Vision 2030. And it speaks about environmental development, but the problem is that in the reality, we sometimes face problems. First, this vision was developed before the latest science, which tell us that sea level rise is a much bigger risk than we used to anticipate. Across the world, by the way. Qatar is no exception, it's everywhere. So the problem is that the big framework doesn't take this too much into, or enough into account. So we need new policies. There are strategies being devised, but we need more efforts. And we can see that in some projects, there is not necessarily the buffer zones or the construction or the infrastructure, the seawalls that can protect the cities. And we can see some of the recent developments, which are very nice, but we may wonder, are they adapted to sea level rise? We can think about Lusail, where a lot of real estate has been developed. We can think about the Corniche. And by the way, Kuwait is having the same problem, Bahrain is having the same problem, and the UAE is having even more of a problem with this matter. Think about Dubai. The whole real estate story of Dubai is threatened by sea level rise. So the big question we should ask is, do we want our real estate to have, instead of nice sandy beaches, this kind of view? This is in Alexandria. This is this year. They are preparing to the increase of sea levels. They are building what we call seawalls. Of course, we can all agree that this is quite ugly. And this is a very good protection against sea level rise, but this is a very good destroyer of the value of your real estate. And that's a problem. It's because the more we wait, the less smart is the adaptation. The more time you have, the best you can adapt. If you do things in a catastrophe mode, of course, this will look like a catastrophe. But there are some other research that we are conducting. Me and my colleague Christiana and some other colleagues were thinking about doing the equivalent of that map, which was made a few years ago for essentially Western cities. They call it global cities, but it's essentially Western cities. We're trying to do it for the Arab region, meaning by which level of sea level rise you're going to be affected depending on which city. And which kind of efforts, of course, because we're not just interested in making these very nice and graphic projections, but we are interested also in providing assistance in terms of expertise for sustainable urban development. But it would be very interesting to show that a city like Venice is pretty similar to some extent to a city like Alexandria in terms of risks and the urgency. And that cities such as Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, and Manama are also under risk. And that we should not wait too much, and that climate change is not the problem of others, but it is ours, and we should not wait. Just between you and I, I'm pretty sure that if you buy a house, it's not for 10 or 15 or 20 years. You want it to be valuable even after. The problem is that in markets such as in the United States, you have cities where the price of real estate has plummeted due to sea level rise, because they have once or twice a year a flooding largely coming from the sea that takes over the city and makes the value of the real estate zero. You don't want to leave the feet in the water, or at least not all the year. I thank you very much. Just some conclusions before I'm done. Climate risk should be seen as a national security emergency. By the way, I say the same in my country, but I think here it's probably more acute, due to the fact that most of Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, as well as Kuwait, have a low-lying coastal zone, meaning they will be the first affected by the ongoing sea level rise. Also, there are solutions which exist. And so it's not just about spending to protect, it's also about investing. It's also about investing to make cities smarter. You know what is that's a quick quiz, but you know what is the best solution to A, protect your coastal area, and B, store carbon on the ground? The best solution is not highly technical, it's mangrove trees. Mangrove trees is the natural environment in the Gulf. So I'm not saying this because I like trees, but it's just because scientifically it's proven that these trees, which live on the coastal area of the Gulf states normally, are the ones which store the most carbon from the atmosphere into their root system and into the soils. And they protect from sea level rise as a buffer zone. And that's interesting because we should think about how much attention has been paid to that. Probably not enough yet. Choices are critical and delay will increase the cost. To finish, smart adaptation to climate change could be an opportunity. In a region, let's be very clear, in the Arab region, where from Morocco till the Sultanate of Oman, from from Syria to Yemen, you will have cities affected by sea level rise and some flooding. If you have Qatar, which can boast, which can say proudly, we are the most climate change proofed country in the Arab region, that's good for business. So this is how we can change what is a structural risk right now into an opportunity. Businessmen don't want to invest in a country where there are electricity blackouts. The same is true with flooding. If you have a business, you don't want it to be stopped during 2 weeks because there is water in the streets. It's no good for business.
But I think
On this, I am done, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lambert. It looks like this is a security threat session given the climate disasters that the GCC states are facing, such as high sea level of water, desertification, etc. So a natural disaster is imminent and only God knows how to avert it. We will open the floor to questions and answers. Kindly introduce yourselves first and be brief and concise. Question only 1 minute for a question. Thank you for the distinguished papers. I am Ahmed Badran from Qatar University. My question is to Dr. Rachid. To which extent the nationally determined contributions reflect seriousness among GCC states in dealing with climate change? Because I am currently conducting a paper or a study of CO2 emission impact on GCC states. If we review the commitments, we see that most of them are only good intentions, and they are not target driven or quantitative reductions. My second question is to Mrs. Amel. Among the shortcomings in GCC is that water is not dealt with as an economic commodity, which affects economic sustainability when it comes to the production of this commodity. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. My name is Muhammad Brahim. I am a student in Doha Institute. Your paper was alarming. My question is to Mrs. Amel. A lack of response by decision makers in relation to climate change will have significant consequences. So this ignorance by decision makers and policy makers in the GCC countries regarding climate change and consequences, what will it lead to? My next question is to Mr. Laurent. خلال القرون الثلاثة الماضية كان هناك تحولات كبيرة جدا في الخصخصة، أي الانتقال من القطاع العام إلى القطاع الخاص. سؤالي: إلى أي مدى تؤثر هذه الخصخصة على التغير المناخي؟ كما تعرف أن القطاع الخاص لا يهتم كثيرا بالتغير المناخي وتبعاته. My name is Busal Ayala. I have a general question. We spoken about climate change and how it affects the GCC countries. Also, how climate change affect countries in conflicts. Do you have any take on that, especially neighboring countries in the GCC region and other countries such as Iraq and Yemen? Hello. Thank you for your valuable papers. My name is Salim Saidi from Morocco. I have PhD in social sciences. I read Vive la Cause book about political geography in the Mediterranean Sea. It is a valuable book. It gives an anticipation about climate change and the conflicts in the GCC states. And it anticipates the role of oil in the conflicts. Another component is water, wars over water. And the author spoke about the historic roots that bring nations together, and without if we do not go back to honoring our roots, of course there will be war over water. In the KSA there are the water vessels, and according to the author, this project will cause wars and conflicts over the water of the Mesopotamia river. And Syria will refuse it or will reject it significantly, because it will affect their supply of water.
Can you hear me? Yes. My name is Wienan Staring. I'm a Dutch national living in Qatar. And a question for my friend, Dr. Laurent. I'm very happy to see all of you back, by the way. As you know, the Dutch live already for centuries. 2/3 of the Dutch live below sea level. Even our Schiphol airport is below sea level. But we manage with dikes, and we have dunes. And of course, like in Alexandria, you have this horrible, let's say, barriers against the sea, but we also have solutions which could be a bit nicer, even with nice beaches. Of course, the Dutch will always be helpful to build dikes in Qatar. I don't know whether that will be the solution. We are doing the same in the United States already. My question is, are you considering dikes or protection in the future? Thank you.
شكرا. سنبدأ دكتور رشيد، تفضل.
Thank you, Mrs. Chairperson. Regarding the seriousness of dealing with NDCs, I believe that the GCC states do not have any other option than being serious. Qatar is threatened by a high sea level. Bahrain also 4% of its land is threatened by a high sea level or sea level rise. In 2032, there are studies that believe oil in KSA will only suffice local or domestic consumption, and therefore the GCC states will be compelled to seriousness. They endorsed the Paris Convention, and they subscribed to such nationally determined contributions willingly and voluntarily. They elected freely to take such measures. When will those measures be implemented? This is a different question. The estimates on relying on a specific percentage of clean energy, or the ambitions to reduce CO2 emissions to a certain target, or a commitment to to plant a specific number of mangroves relies on the involvement or engagement of the society, but also of policy makers and decision makers. Change is hard to achieve. Also, a change should start from within. Any individual can bring about a change. For example, when building or buying their house, they should take into consideration that the house is green. It reduces CO2 emissions. Threats do not only involve GCC states. Threats are universal. But in the GCC states, those threats are compounded by other historic, economic, and geopolitical factors such as the conflicts within the region, as well as the competition or a fight over wealthy regions inside the GCC. Today the problematic is strategic, it is international. Yes, there is competition over fresh water, and there are efforts exerted in this regard, but everyone should commit to rationalizing consumption and in the next stage providing or relying on alternative resources. This calls for a collective social awareness, of course. Regarding water, the problematic here, and in fact, water and oil are two separate problems. Oil is a economic commodity, but can we put a price tag on water and make it subject to demand and supply law? This is hard because historically water was always a free of charge good or commodity. The World Bank presented water as a economic commodity, and this was a new concept, and it wasn't accepted by all. So here what we can do is to have a water tariff that is proportional to the consumption. For example, the tariff is different on regular residents than on farmers, for example, or industrialists. So it is unlikely for water to be dealt with as an economic commodity per se, knowing that some states do have ambitions for water to become an economic or free trade market. This is hard because water is a prerequisite for life, and it is hard to commoditize it. Regarding climate change, so this problem, this issue is worldwide. There are dozens of publications and books dealing with climate change, but those remain literature and theories. In the GCC states, there are studies signaling that a higher sea level will lead to cities, Gulf cities, drowning or flooding. But all these remain studies. Extraction of oil and desalination, numerous and countless desalination plants in GCC states, and 100 other irresponsible practices were the cause of such a climate change. So GCC states should take ownership of such practices, and In the national visions of the GCC states, there are mentioning of climate change and measures to mitigate their risks, but on the ground, implementation lacks. There is no true willing or will, excuse me, to implement such measures, and this this holds true in all Arab countries and not only the Gulf states. When we speak about water scarcity in the Arab region at large, the aim here is to shed light on the alarming or seriousness of the issue. The World Bank, and according to their studies, the World Bank is a hidden lobbyist or advocate in the water issue in the GCC states. We know that traditionally and historically GCC states did not have an issue of water until such a hidden agenda starting to emerge in the Litani River in Lebanon as well, or the rivers in Syria, or even in Egypt. Such an agenda started to show themselves. Desalination in the GCC states is a non-traditional way of providing water. However, we cannot take it as a sustainable source of water, because if we keep exploiting non-renewable sources of non-renewable resources, the future generations will have no such resources left for their survival. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. They're quite hard to answer for some of them. I'll try my best to say something interesting. In terms of privatization's effect on climate change, it's very complex. On the one hand, you have definitely some positive outcomes. I'm not an advocate necessarily of all these privatizations. The World Bank, it's true, has been pushing very strongly for many privatizations, and some cases have been disastrous. But sometimes privatizations have brought positive outcomes. When it comes to, for instance, improving the technologies which are being used for desalination, which is a very dirty industry, to be honest. I mean, it generates water. It's highly needed. We need it. We couldn't have Qatar as it is today without desalination, let's be clear. But at the same time, we have to be concerned about the amount of carbon dioxide which is emitted by it. And it's not just carbon dioxide. So privatizations had a positive effect in terms of providing cleaner technologies. If we take the examples of the Gulf, the 6 Gulf countries have, no, not Kuwait, 5 Gulf countries have had privatizations which have been successful in the sense that foreign companies with the national government have worked together and provided new technologies which are more efficient. Reverse osmosis, for instance, is a more efficient, energy efficient technology. But the problem is that privatizations goes beyond just developing new facilities for power generation and desalination. And often we find that when you have a sort of liberal or neoliberal agenda when it comes to urban planning, for instance, it tends to give, free reins to, all this freedom to act to the private sector. And sometimes the private sector doesn't really care about the environment. It cares about money, and it's its role, by the way. So it cares about money, and money, the fastest, the better. So we have seen in the past some issues with, extreme deforestation in some places, not so much in the GCC, even in Qatar, in some places, when there was no strict legislation, they would just chop down all the small trees that you could have, even if the construction was not there. But it was just common practice for companies. So it's a mixed outcome. And I think the government has made some progress here in Qatar, in the UAE as well. Not so much in some other GCC countries. In Oman also, they are doing not so bad. But there is still a lot more to be done in terms of regulations. The problem is that if the private sector is not regulated, it does what it thinks is the most economically efficient. And the environment is a second matter, at best. With regards to climate change and conflicts, there is very interesting literature that says that climate change tends not to be the main factor for conflicts, but it generally generates dynamics of conflict. And the case of Syria has been spoken or written a lot about. Many people say that Syria, just before the Arab Spring Revolution, which was the spark, but just before that was experiencing years of drought, and very severe drought. These years of severe drought have brought large quantities of people from the countryside to the cities because they needed to find a job just for survival. And these people also who, when there were these demonstrations, who participated to the demonstration, which eventually began to be anti-regime and then a sort of revolution rather than just demonstrations. We won't go into Arab Spring politics, it's too complex, but what I want to say is that in the case of Yemen, this is a big concern, because Yemen already before the Arab Spring and the civil war with foreign actors, it was already a key country in terms of concerns, in terms of water per capita. There was already what some say a national water crisis. I tend to say it's accumulation of water crisis in many different areas. And on top of that, now the government doesn't control much of the territory. So in terms of intervention, there is not much which can be done easily. There is almost a stateless country, or a country with too many states with very little activity. So this is a key concern. And I think it is a concern, by the way, for the students who are here and also for my colleagues, that needs to be further researched and for a long time to come. Lastly, with regards to the Dutch expertise, which is world-renowned, of course, with regards to dikes and constructing in areas where generally we say you should not construct, you should not build. The Dutch have shown that they can manage the risks in a very smart manner. I think, of course, there is a lot of room for technology transfer, expertise transfer, but where I would have one concern is that if there is just the technology transfer, but there is not the expertise transfer at the level of government. Because we need to have these best practices which are done in countries which are experienced in terms of mitigating sea level rise or big tides or storm events. We need to have also this expertise at the government level so that there is better urban planning. And it is, for now, what is really needed alongside what is technology and led by the private sector. So I think there is a lot of room for the Dutch government and Dutch companies to intervene in Qatar and across the region very much. Thank you.
I would like to thank the panelists. Whether we like it or not, sea level rise, sea temperature rise, water scarcity, and environmental disasters are imminent in the GCC states. The governments are called to provide as many reforms as possible. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.